For all in attendance, today's meeting is being live streamed and will be available as a video as well. Noting the presence of a quorum, I'd like to call this meeting to order. I'll note that earlier in the day, the Commission elected me to chair both the executive and open session meetings. It's all about me, yeah. Anyway, so let's move to agenda item 2, which is the report of the vice chairman. That's also me. Last week, the executive director of the commission, Mr. Marcel Acosta, and I met with Mr. Thomas Lupke, the secretary of the Commission of Fine Arts. We discussed our respective review responsibilities and our shared mission to plan and preserve the important historical and natural features of the nation's capital. It was a very positive and informative session, so I really appreciate you joining Mr. Acosta on that. Thank you very much. Agenda item 3 is the report of the executive director, Mr. Acosta.
I guess that's me. I do have one item of public interest. Should the commission authorize the release of the draft workplace element of the comprehensive plan? At today's meeting, we'll hold 2 open houses to brief the public. The sessions will be held on Tuesday, August 6th at 6 p.m. and Wednesday, August 7th at 10:30 a.m. The open houses will be held right here at NCPC offices, and members of the public are invited to attend. And you'll find information posted on our website after this meeting. And that's it, and I did submit a written report, and if you have any questions, I'll be happy to answer that.
Thank you. Okay, agenda item 4 is a legislative update. Ms. Schuyler, you always have some exciting things to tell us about.
Not today.
Not today.
Sorry.
Okay. Short report. Thank you very much. Agenda item 5 is the consent calendar items. There are 4 consent calendar items on this month's agenda. Item 5A is for a tennis pavilion at the White House complex submitted by the National Park Service. Item 5B is for building envelope repairs at the Hirshhorn Museum submitted by the Smithsonian Institution. Item 5C is for lighting replacements at the U.S. Air Force Memorial submitted by the Department of Defense, Department of the Air Force. And item 5D is for unified signage and lighting standards in Rock Creek Park, submitted by the National Park Service. Is there a motion to approve the consent calendar? And a second? Second. All in favor of moving on the consent calendar, please signify by saying aye.
Aye.
Aye. Any opposed? Unanimously passed. Thank you. Okay, now we'll start with the open session. So item 6A is for final site and building plan approvals for the new master clock facility at the U.S. Naval Observatory. Thank you, Mr. Webb. Look forward to your presentation.
Thank you. Good afternoon, members of the Commission. The Department of Navy has submitted final site and building plans for the construction of a new master clocks facility and the rehabilitation of several historic buildings on the United States Naval Observatory campus here in Washington. The Commission reviewed the preliminary design a year ago at its July 12, 2018 meeting, and earlier that day, the Commission toured the campus. The Naval Observatory campus is comprised of approximately 72 acres and is located in the northwest quadrant of the District of Columbia, approximately a half-mile west of Rock Creek between Massachusetts and Wisconsin Avenues. On the map to the right, you can see it is surrounded by densely populated neighborhoods, with Woodley Park to the east, Glover Park to the west, Georgetown is located to the southwest, and the National Cathedral is to the north. As a reminder, 4 primary tenants occupy the campus: the United States Naval Observatory, the Oceanographer of the Navy, the United States Secret Service, and the residence of the Vice President of the United States. The areas of work for this project are indicated on this site plan in blue. While the Commission approved a master plan for the Naval Observatory campus in 2014, a new master clock facility was not captured in the plan. However, an extensive basic facilities requirements and programming analysis was performed, which identified the need for a new master clock facility at the Naval Observatory. The analysis also identified the need to rehabilitate the old clock building, which is indicated as Building 3, and buildings 52, 52A, and 78 to accommodate the required functions and personnel for the project. The old clock house will continue to serve as the operations base and sleeping quarters for the astronomers. The Naval Observatory performs an essential scientific role for the United States, the Navy, and the Department of Defense. Its mission includes determining the positions and motions of the Earth and other celestial objects, maintaining precise time, determining the Earth's orientation in space, and maintaining the master clock for the Department of Defense. Observatory physicists, engineers, and technicians develop and maintain the master clock and its systems. This astronomical and timing data is essential for accurate navigation and the support of communications on Earth and in space. It is also used extensively by other agencies of the government and the public at large. Staff notes that the campus has been determined eligible as a historic district for the National Register of Historic Places, with buildings, structures, and landscape elements contributing to historic significance. The period of significance begins in 1881 and ends in 1954. Architect Richard Morris Hunt designed many of the buildings and landscape features for the campus beginning in the 1880s. These buildings are the only known examples of his work here in Washington and include the Clock House and the Administration Building. Hunt was a prominent architect of the Gilded Age and is known for his work on the pedestal for the Statue of Liberty and Biltmore House in Asheville, North Carolina. Now let's look at the final design for the new master clock facility, which is also known as Building 51 on the campus. While consolidating many functions into one building, the design of the new master clock facility must address many requirements and constraints while meeting the mission and project needs, integrating into the existing site and landscape, while being as close to the center of the campus as possible, and being compatible with the existing buildings and spatial organization of the campus. Staff notes that prior to submitting for the preliminary review by the Commission last year, the site location was moved from an earlier considered location directly north of the clock house, so that the new master clock facility would not visually compete with the historic buildings centered on the clock house, nor impact the axial relationship established by architect Hunt. And therefore, staff recommends that the Commission supports the Navy's location for the new master clock facility at the Naval Observatory, as the site location is lower in grade than the historic clock house, which is Building 3. Looking at the design for the new master clock facility, the function of the facility requires the building to be linear in plan, one story, and approximately 15,000 square feet. It is served by redundant equipment rooms located at each end. For security reasons, a single central entrance is the sole ingress and egress point for the building, with emergency exits combined with equipment room accesses at each end. The building's operational program requires that there be no windows, and therefore the only other openings on the exterior are those required to support the mechanical systems. During the Section 106 consultation process, the design of the facility evolved to reflect a minimalist contemporary expression, which quiets the building, allowing it to be in the background and not competing with the historic buildings on the campus. It is rectangular in form with two wings that intersect to give way to the main entrance. The elevations are a single plane of cast stone panels. The roof slopes to the north with rain draining into a continuous gutter along the rear of the building. The facade facing the old clock house has only three openings, the main entrance and the combined emergency egress and service entrances on either side. You may recall during the preliminary review, a security fence was proposed around the new master clock facility. This has been removed as it was determined by the applicant as it is no longer needed. And here is a rendering showing the main entrance into the facility to the left of the image and one of the emergency egress and service entrances to the right. And as a reminder, here is how it had been rendered during the preliminary review, and it still shows the security fence, which is no longer going to be constructed. And here is a rendering of the back of the facility. The Commission previously had requested additional views of the building, and the applicant has provided those for the final submission. Overall, staff believes that the views support the siding and the design approach for the building. The exterior finishes shown here on this slide are intended to complement the other buildings and structures on the campus, especially the telescope structures. The material selection is also complementary to the building's minimalist nature, including architectural precast panels with mortar joints for the exterior siding with aluminum composite panels and louvers. Therefore, staff recommends the Commission supports the design of the new master clock facility as it does not compete with the architectural character of the historic contributing buildings designed by Hunt while relating to its function as a structure to contain the master clocks for the Department of the Navy and acting similar to a computer server room. Now I'm going to walk you through the proposed building rehabilitations that are also part of the final application. The first one, Building 3, is the original clock house designed by Richard Morris Hunt in 1893. Here are the existing condition photographs of Building 3 as well as the foundations of Buildings 6 and 7 on either side. Building 3 will continue to serve as the operations base and sleeping quarters for the astronomers. The foundations for the historic transit houses, Buildings 6 and 7, will be stabilized. The current vinyl siding on the exterior will be removed and wood siding will be installed with trim based on original construction documents. The cut stone on the center portion of the building will be restored through repair, repointing, and cleaning, and the existing standing seam copper roof will be retained. A new ADA access lift will be included by removing the existing elevated concrete walkways and replacing them with stoops similar to those originally designed for the building. The next building to be restored is the attached buildings 52 and 52A. The existing non-original windows and exterior doors will be replaced to meet current anti-terrorism protection requirements, and the existing EFIS exterior will be patched and repaired where needed. New roofing will also be provided for building 52A. And the final building to be rehabbed in this project is building 78, which consists of the original one-story astrographic laboratory built in 1932 with a two-story addition completed in 1961, forming a T-shaped footprint. Exterior rehabilitation will consist of stone repairs, repointing, and cleaning. The existing non-original windows will be replaced with new anti-terrorism and force protection windows in the original window configuration. Since the preliminary review previously proposed bioretention basins near buildings 52, 52A, and 78 have been eliminated as stormwater management solutions around buildings 3 and 51 meet the requirements for the site. Landscape plantings will support bioretention areas and bioswales while maintaining sensitivity to the historic landscape. Plant materials would be selected from the Naval Observatory native plant palette. New shallow bioretention basins lined with turf grass will blend with the open lawn character. Native trees and herbaceous cover will be incorporated within the deeper basins as appropriate. Vehicular access to Building 51 will be provided by extending Goldsboro Avenue east between Buildings 3 and 51 back to Newcomb Place. To conclude, the design of the new master clock facility balances highly constrained and specialized operational program requirements and historic preservation considerations. The site location, design expression, massing, and material palette of the proposed new building are compatible with the character of the existing historic buildings and the historic Naval Observatory campus while avoiding visually competing with the most significant of the historic buildings. Therefore, it is the Executive Director's recommendation that the Commission approves the Navy's final site and building plans to consolidate the master clock functions into one facility and rehabilitate historic contributing buildings on the campus. I've already covered the rest of the recommendations, so I'll conclude my presentation. We have representatives from the Navy who are here to help answer any questions you may have. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Webb. I'll start off comment just by thanking and complimenting the team for the sort of sensitive site placement and removal of the fence. Some of us who were able to go out on the site, I'll say when I first saw this in preliminary, I had a lot of questions and concerns about the overall proposal. But I feel as though there's been a lot of work to find the right place on the site. And also, the fence just seemed antithetical to a place that already is highly secure and also is very pastoral. It's a wide open, rolling hills and beautiful landscapes. And so I'll compliment that. And I do just want to say, it might be a little bit of a tongue-in-cheek, but I will agree with you that Building 51 definitely doesn't compete with historic buildings in terms of its design. And I guess in this case, that's a good thing. So thank you.
Thank you.
Open for any other comments or questions? Commissioner Wright.
Yeah, and because I beat up on DOD last time, I want to say something nice. I actually think the building settles very nicely into the landscape, as quietly as it possibly can and should. And also, I think the approach to the historic buildings is very sensitive, surprisingly so. So thank you.
Yeah.
I'm going to vote yes.
Hallelujah. Any other comments? Commissioner Sajil.
No, I think the team went back after the comments last time they came in over here. I think they incorporated those and see the results of that. So the team did a good job.
Yes. Commissioner Argo.
I
Yes.
just had a quick question. Has there ever
Sorry. Just to follow up on your comment, I think, I wasn't here, I wasn't on the commission then, but I think this looks integrated in a way that you would expect. I wish I'd been able to go on the field trip.
Oh, it's fascinating.
It's, I mean, for 20 years drove past it every day, and I have no idea what's in the inside. Now I know. I was curious whether there has ever been security issues in the clock building itself?
Julie, would you like to speak to that, or Nick?
No?
On the records.
Please come up to the microphone and give us your name and your title, please.
Hi, my name is Dagoberto Portillo. I'm with NAFAC Washington. I'm the design manager for this project. And to our knowledge, there hasn't been any security issues at the clock room, or at least not that we know of.
Thank you.
One of the most fascinating things for me was to learn about all the redundancy that occurs and the important mission of this activity and the building that will house that. So it's amazing how much we all live by what goes on in that little simple building right there. So, any other questions or comments? Okay, so is there a motion to approve the comments on the plan for final site plan for the new master clock facility at the U.S. Naval Observatory?
So moved.
And is there a second? Second. All in favor, please signify by saying aye.
Aye.
Any opposed? Okay, motion is carried unanimously. Thank you. Okay, next is agenda item 6B, which is approval of the revised final site and building plans for lighting and an entry gate at Planet Word, submitted by the District Deputy Mayor for Planning and Economic Development. Mr. Webb will also walk us through this presentation. Thank you.
Second one. Thank you. I'm back. Good afternoon, members of the commission, again. The DC Office of the Deputy, here we go. The Deputy Mayor for Planning and Economic Development has submitted revised site and building plans for the rehabilitation of the Franklin School for your review. Once rehabilitated, the Franklin School will house the experiential museum Planet Word. As a reminder, the Commission approved the preliminary and final plans for the project back at the March 7th Commission meeting. However, the exterior lighting was not a component of that application, but is now before you today, as well as a new design approach for the entry gate to the terrace off of K Street. Located in northwest DC, the school sits across from Franklin Park, northeast of the White House, and west of the Convention Center. It fronts on 13th Street northwest between K Street to the north and I Street to the south. As I mentioned, the focus of today's presentation will be the new design for the entry gate to the terrace entrance located on the back side of the building and exterior lighting for the signage in the west facade. Before we look at the components of today's application, as we discussed back in March at the Commission meeting, a memorandum of agreement was executed to complete the Section 106 consultation process, which included monthly site visits by NCPC staff, me, and when available, the DC SHPO staff and the National Park Service to monitor the ongoing work. So you know we have been conducting these monthly site visits to ensure that the work is in accordance with what was approved by the Commission and in agreement with by consulting parties in the Section 106 process. So here on the screen are a few images of the work taken from the site visit in June. Now let's look at the new entry gate design for the entrance terrace off K Street. Here is a view looking south where the current wall will be removed to create access to a new entrance plaza or terrace from the K Street side. The previous entry gate design was intended to resemble a book opening and closing. The applicant had indicated that this gate was 9 feet tall on the ends and 7 feet at the low point where the two fans met. At the March meeting, the Commission commented on the heaviness of that design and questioned whether the low point in the gate, where the fans meet, would allow someone to easily climb over, posing a security issue. Overall, the Commission supported relating the design of the gate to aspects of the museum's mission. In this rendering, you can also see the speaking willow sculpture that will be located in the terrace. Based on the Commission discussion, the applicant has submitted a new design approach for the gate to address the Commission's concerns. On this plan, you can see the gate location outlined in red. The new gate design is comprised of 3 sliding panels that retract behind a 4th fixed panel when opened. No component of the gate is directly attached to the school building. It is also not connected to the building at the east end of the site. The sliding panels open away from the entry stair and ramp landing when in the open position. Here is a rendering showing the new entry gate when closed. Staff notes that this new design approach to the entry gate relates to the speaking willow sculpture located in the terrace. The gate provides both security and transparency to appreciate the sculpture and space when the Planet Word is not open. The panels for the new gate are 8 feet in height and are the same aluminum powder-coated material and color as previously approved back in March. And here is a rendering showing the gate when open. When retracted, the panels screen the mid-landing of the ramp while retaining an openness for the terrace and views to the speaking willow sculpture. Now let's look at the proposed exterior lighting for the approved signs in the main facade. Just to remind you, here is the existing condition photographs of the main facade of the school facing Franklin Park. On March 7th, the Commission reviewed and approved the final site and building plans, which included exterior signage as shown in this drawing, consisting of 2 monument signs and 1 banner sign. The exterior lighting strategy was not a component of this approval, with the commission noting that the approved monument signs were not internally lit and that the applicant would submit all exterior lighting for both the building and the signs to the commission for review and approval once it had been developed. Here is a rendering again of the approved monument signs shown in red and outlined in yellow, with one located on the landing of the historic entrance off 13th Street and the other set back from the corner of 13th Street and K Street. Our colors look really dark. And here is a rendering showing the approved banner sign, which is adjacent to the new entrance terrace. The exterior lighting proposed consists of flushed in-ground mounted lighting for the monument and banner signs. This slide is a rendering showing the details for the monument signs. And here are details for the banner sign lighting. This slide shows the details for the flood lighting proposed for the west facade of the Franklin School, mounted in the existing areaway, the stair landing, and planters, all on the west elevation of the building. The approved signs and the proposed lighting for the signs in the west facade of the building are actually located outside of the building property line and in public space. Thus, staff notes that any improvements in public space will require a public space permit in coordination with the District of Columbia Department of Transportation Office of Public Space. Staff does believe that the lighting approach is appropriate and sensitive to the design of the building. It is minimal in its approach by only providing focused lighting to the three signs and to the main facade of the building facing Franklin Park. Overall, the new gate design approach appears more inviting than the previous design while relating to the Speaking Willow sculpture, and the consistent panel height of 8 feet addresses the Commission's concerns about security for the terrace when the gate is closed. The proposed lighting approach is also appropriate and sympathetic to the building design. Therefore, it is the Executive Director's recommendation that the Commission approves the revised final site and building plans for the rehabilitation and modernization of the Franklin School. I've covered the other recommendations, so this concludes my presentation, and we have representatives from the Planet Word team here to assist in answering any questions you may have. Thank you.
Thank you again, Mr. Webb. I think since I had some comments about the gate before, I'm going to start things off. You may recall I was inspired from the original gate design. I was looking forward to the final season of Game of Thrones, and I was inspired by the throne itself as sort of the what I was seeing with the original design. And I think in this case, the three-eyed raven has spoken now, and the weirwood tree, which is similar. The weirwood tree, which is similar to the willow tree that is now going to speak, I think is really a wonderful solution. So I applaud the team for their work to, I think, arrive at a more sensitive and welcoming entryway for what will be a tremendous destination. We're just so excited to see this building coming and back to life. So thank you. Any other comments or questions?
In English?
You got to read. You got to just go watch the show.
Like a new cultural.
Or read the book. Comments, thoughts, questions? Okay. Is there a motion to approve the revised final site and building plans for the Planet Word?
So moved.
It's been moved. Second. All in favor, please signify by saying aye.
Aye.
Aye. Any opposed? Unanimously carried. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Okay, rolling right along. The next item is Agenda Item 6C, is the authorization to release the draft federal workplace element update for a 60-day public comment period. I think this is really an important document because it guides us as we evaluate things like the Federal Capital Improvement Program. And Ms. DuPont is going to present for this agenda item.
Good afternoon again.
Thank you.
Members of the Commission, I am here to present the draft federal workplace element of the comprehensive plan for the National Capital and requesting authorization to release a draft for a 60-day public comment period. The comprehensive plan is a document that guides planning and development in Washington, D.C. and the surrounding region. It's comprised of two parts: the district elements prepared by the D.C. Office of Planning, which addresses traditional city planning issues such as land use and housing. At our upcoming September meeting, D.C. Office of Planning will provide the Commission an update on their second amendment cycle of the district elements. And then the second part is the federal elements, and this is prepared by NCPC. This provides a policy framework for the federal government in managing its operations and activities in the National Capital Region. The federal elements are the decision-making framework for Commission actions on plans and proposals submitted to the Commission for your review. We update the comprehensive plan on a regular basis. In 2016, the Commission adopted 7 of the 8 federal elements, with the exception of the Parks and Open Space, which was adopted in 2019. Over the past year, we've been working on updating both the federal workplace element and the transportation element, and anticipate bringing the draft transportation element to the Commission this fall. We decided to update the federal workplace element to address new trends and major drivers shaping the workplace. Some of the key highlights to this update include reframing the element around new guiding principles. This is consistent with the structural organization of the recently updated Parks and Open Space element. This update also includes new topics that reflect current issues and trends, and staff analyzed the existing policies, identified areas and opportunities for clarification, and considered ways to make the update more efficient and effective for staff, agencies, and public use. The federal government is the single largest owner and occupant of real property in the region, and a significant contributor to the region's economic health and trends related to transportation, environmental stewardship, real estate, workforce development, and employment. The goal of the federal workplace element is to emphasize Washington as the seat of the federal government, efficiently plan and locate federal workplaces so they contribute to the National Capital Region's economic well-being, promote resource protection, and provide sustainable and healthy work environments for its workforce. The way the federal government manages its assets and operations is evolving in response to new laws, policies, and technologies that allow for workplace mobility. These major drivers are reshaping the federal government's physical footprint and poses important implications to the future of local communities and the region, specifically to the development patterns and the regional economy. The element is structured around 4 new guiding principles which reflect current issues, trends, challenges, and opportunities faced by federal workplaces in the region. Together, these principles provide guidance to improve the operational efficiency and productivity to the planning, location, design, and operation of federal workplaces. In the following slides, I will provide an overview of the new guiding principles and highlight some of the new policies that have been included in the update. The first guiding principle is adapt to the changing needs of the federal workplace. Federal agencies are planning federal workplaces more efficiently by consolidating, co-locating, disposing of excess property, and moving out of lease into federally ownership. This section encourages agencies to continue to manage and reinvest for the efficient use of existing facilities and plan for future workplaces that address long-term space needs, integrates resilience planning, is a positive presence in the region, and minimizes impacts on communities and the regional economy. It also reinforces the seat of the federal government by retaining a majority of the federal employment in Washington. And when planning for the reuse of existing buildings and lands, federal agencies should evaluate future uses that minimize impacts on affected communities and contributes to realizing existing community development opportunities. The second guiding principle is locate federal facilities strategically. There are many factors that influence an agency's decision on where to locate, including agency mission and space needs, cost, security needs, and transit availability. This guiding principle considers selecting location-efficient sites that utilize existing resources, balances security needs, provides access to transportation, and protects natural resources. And to locate federal facilities in areas that help advance local and regional planning goals, such as prioritizing the location of federal workplaces within the designated central employment area, sites in proximity to transit, and identified by local jurisdictions as priority places for federal facilities. The third guiding principle is design sustainable and healthy work environments. There is a close relationship between the design of the built environment and personal health. This section focuses on planning for sustainable work environments by improving pedestrian bicycle circulation, considering site sustainability, building orientation and improvements, which can all help meet energy efficiency goals and building performance targets. This section also focuses on designing healthy work environments that provide access to natures and views, incorporate daylight, improve air quality, promote active work environments, and considers flexibility in the workplace. Healthier conditions in the workplace can promote productivity, enhance employee health and wellness, and help retain, recruit, and motivate the workforce. And our last guiding principle is integrating federal facilities with their surrounding communities. Federal facilities and installations are important parts of their neighborhood and should find opportunities to integrate with those communities and share and leverage resources. This policy section focuses on opportunities for federal facilities to coordinate, engage, and partner with their communities to effectively meet shared goals and contribute to the vitality of the community. In terms of next steps, following Commission's authorization to release the draft element, we will have a 60-day public comment period and post a notice in the Federal Register. The draft element will be available online on our NCPC website for review and comment. We will have 2 open houses on August 6th and 7th where the public can learn more about the update and provide written comments. And following the public comment period, we will post all of the public comments on our website. We will revise the element to address public comments, incorporate additional graphics, and bring a revised draft later in the year for the Commission's review and comment for final adoption. It is the Executive Director's recommendation that the Commission authorize the release of the draft federal workplace element for a 60-day public comment period. That concludes my presentation.
Thank you, Ms. DuPont. Just one clarification. At the end of the public review period, when you bring it back, will you be highlighting things that we may have changed based on that feedback we're getting?
Yes, we'll summarize the changes that we made, from changes from the draft policies to the final policies, and also big picture, what were the larger changes that we made.
Okay. I just want to kick things off by, again, thanking you and the staff for arriving at these 4 guiding principles. It's not easy to project the world that federal workers are going to be working in with all the changes in technology and so forth, but it seems to be a really strong balance between the quality of the workforce and advancing other social and community objectives, which I think really is something that not all of us think about when we think about, it's more than a workplace. It's also where everyone lives and works and engages with the surrounding community. So I really applaud the staff for producing this draft document. Any other comments, questions, thoughts at this point? Commissioner Trueblood.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Thank you for this work. I think I agree. There's the nature of the workplace has even changed since this was done a few years ago, and is constantly changing, and I think we're all kind of grappling with what that means. And so I appreciate the work you're doing. I know that we've been in discussion with you. A key tenet that I think has been important for the District of Columbia traditionally in this element has been the 60-40 rule 60-40 ratio. There you go. Thank you. The policy that talked about 60% of the space in the District of the space that the federal government uses in the District of Columbia. I know you addressed in the report the fact that that number was probably put together at a different time when that was when that was the ratio, but it has not been that way for a generation. And I think I know that you guys have worked with us to come up with some language around what it might look like. That being said, I never want to let the real get in the way of the ideal. And so I do think I'm interested to hear what the public has to say about this. I think aspirational goals can sometimes be good, even if they're hard or even if they're impossible. So I think there might be more opportunity to think about what that looks like. But we all do recognize that the trends are changing. So I just wanted to put that on the record. But I will be looking forward to hear what the public has to say about this.
Mr. Chairman?
Yes, Commissioner Dixon.
I want to make, I think, maybe a tweak from what you said. It's really 60-40 in terms of employment, not space, right? And that raises my concern about the space issue. I mean, I think that if we had access to the space, we could probably get more tax revenue in. GSA, I didn't mean to, but it's the people we may want to keep, but the space is another discussion, I think. And whether the economics of the space for our city may be different than the economics for the people who are in the government working here.
Can I just respond? Because actually, and maybe Mr. Cash wants to weigh in as well, because we had a little conversation about this. Insofar as we understand there's actually value, Walter Reed was an example we talked about. We were all aligned behind that, transferring over to the district and the value that would create for the district. So I don't think, this is a high-level goal rather than to drive any particular decision. And I think there's a different discussion to be had about real estate versus the employment. While the District of Columbia has been working to diversify the economy and the region as well, I think federal government is still the base of our employment. It creates great jobs. It creates jobs with career ladders. So there's a whole host of reasons why having those try to retain those in the District of Columbia is an important goal.
Well, Mr. Chairman, I also would add that the lack of commuter tax means that we don't necessarily get revenue from people who work here. If those employees were DC residents, which is complicated, then that would be a different discussion. But this could go, sort of unwind, goes on and on. But we'll see what the public has to say about it.
Commissioner Cash.
Thank you. I just want to agree with everything Commissioner Trueblood said. I think that it really is a double-edged sword here because we have a changing economy. There was some mention about the DC. We've kind of had our first stab at updating our framework of our elements, and one of the acknowledgments in there is that we really have had a really diversifying workforce here over the last several years. We're relying less on the federal government, which is really good for DC, but at the end of the day, DC wouldn't really be here, but not for the federal government. So I think that even if it is an aspirational goal, the 60-40 is still something to work towards, and I'll be interested to see what the public has to say. And I definitely agree that the other edge of that sword that I mentioned is really about the efficiency. So I think that everyone agrees Walter Reed going was a great thing. We probably pretty universally agree that the FBI going out of town wouldn't make much of a difference when it comes to our actual employment base here, and that space could be better utilized. But I think that speaks to some of the things that are in this element about kind of talk about the efficiency of the federal workspace. And I mean, I know that when the Coast Guard headquarters was created, there was a lot of talk about the efficiencies that go on there, and I mean, teleworking and all that. So I think that there's a lot more, there's a lot of layers to this workforce piece. So I just want to put that out there. And also just with regard to the aspirational goals, I mean, yes, it is aspirational. We've been, I think, around 51, 52% lately. There's another aspiration in the federal elements, which is the parking ratios, that as much as we know we are never going to come close to the parking ratios envisioned in the comp plan when it comes to places like the Pentagon or a lot of other facilities, this commission really beats up on folks when they come to us with submissions that don't get there. And I would hope that we can be just as aspirational about DC employment as we can be about parking ratios in the region. So I just want to put that on the record. But I definitely agree with all the comments of my colleagues.
Mr. Chairman, I guess I'm volleying back in, and it seems to be kind of discussion with DC folk. You made it a little bit
great.
But that's good. And I'll be very, very, very excited about what the public has to say about this. Because I have found over time that the wisdom within the community is much broader than the wisdom which we have in our own head. Sometimes they come up with some really interesting ideas. I also think that this idea of who the people are who are here and whether they bring any revenue back into the city is a delicate discussion because we'd like to be able to get money from them if we could, like other jurisdictions do. I had another point, but I guess it slipped my mind now. It'll come back to me after
Okay,
a minute or two.
we'll hang
Thank
in
you.
there. Yes, Commissioner Argo.
I would like to echo the comments of my colleagues that represent the leadership in the District of Columbia government. And having worked in that government as well, as many of us have, I mean, and having lived here for nearly 40 years, you know, I think you can't dismiss the fact of the significance and the significance of the federal employment presence. And, you know, one of the things I think the district has tried to do, and I'm not going to talk about any particular policy, but, you know, the district also has been pretty consistent about providing policies that are generous to federal workers who work in the District of Columbia. And so it's kind of a two-way street in terms of some of the recent policies that have been, you know, that have been passed by the city council and signed by the mayor. I think whatever we can do, I'll just conclude and not wander into that swamp any further. But I would like to see the strongest support and hope that comes out for retaining the strength of the, you know, of the federal government employee as a core piece of the work element and not discarding it for softer language.
Okay.
That's my position.
Mr. Chairman, I know what I wanted to bring up also.
Thank you.
I don't think that we're going to see the Capitol moved or the monument moved or the White House moved. And as long as they're here, then we will be the nation's capital.
Right.
Doesn't have to do with the office buildings that are here. It has to do with the presence of the government, which will, I think, stay here. I also think, you know, I served for many years ago as chairman of the Compact, the D.C. Statehood Compact Commission. And we were the structure or body that had to do the research for not just the politics of statehood, but the real nuts and bolts economics of it. And the one thing that we always had to deal with was the land, the enclave. What is the D.C. federal government enclave, which was the land that, you know, and that was tied to buildings and structures, but had little to do with the politics of why we should have maybe statehood if we got it. So the more buildings we have, the less taxes and the bigger compound, the footprint the federal government has here. So I'm looking forward to what the public says about this, but don't worry. I don't think we need to worry about us not being the nation's capital and getting the pizzazz that we deserve for it. We don't usually get much pizzazz for it. We usually get criticized. D.C. is in trouble, but it's not D.C. that's in trouble. Sometimes the federal government has problems. At any rate, we could go on. Let's see what the public says, but I don't think we need to. The nation's capital is going to be the nation's capital, I think. But maybe, who knows what could happen.
Well, I find it interesting that, you know, these four guiding principles that are in this, the workplace element, really do create an aspiration that will continue to attract people, talented, gifted, committed people to the federal workforce. It's because of things like this that will be a magnet to continue to pull talented people into the federal workforce. And when you combine that with a city that is continuing to rise and improve and grow and expand and adapt to changing technology, attractiveness to the kind of workplace and workforce that could be desirable through this. I think these are a confluence of items that work in favor of everything, this aspiration that we're here talking about. So,
Mr. Chairman, I guess the other thing I want to mention is that we're struggling in our community with gentrification. And the reason we struggle is because housing costs often exceed people's employment income. Federal government employees better get some big raises if they want to stay in the District of Columbia in the long-term future. Because we even finding young people, there was, 2,000 coming into our community on a regular basis per month, a number of years ago at least. I think that number is beginning to shift a little because some of those young people are looking for jobs that offer more money so they can buy condos and houses and rent and live. So this concept of government employees, unless the salaries are competitive, we may have secretaries and cabinet level people and high level people who may stay and may be able to afford the housing here, but it's the same issue we face with gentrification for the lower income people in our community at this point. So, big issue.
thank you.
Can I
Commissioner
drag us
Wright.
down into the mundane?
Drag you.
We were waiting for you.
I think you already know this, but my office has one just kind of big comment because we do this with all the federal agencies. They have space standards or are catching up and have struggled to establish and adhere to space standards. By the time they've gotten it, is everyone clear? Now everyone's unclear because there's this vicious rumor that we are going back to private offices and, windows for 15s and SESs. And you're a grade 14, so your credenza gets to be so big. Not true. The pendulum, yes, is swinging, I suppose, a little bit. But I guess what we want to caution against is getting too specific in the element because it may muddy the already muddied waters with what are policies, sort of macro policies and what are micro thou shalt do, mandatory standards and the like. So, and some people who are reading this, they won't know what a plan element is. They won't really understand the difference. And because this continues to be such a controversial topic, and it's very emotional, it's, I think, particularly important to sort of spell it out, what this means in terms of that it's like a master plan, right? This is a guide, but not handcuffs. Something like that. That makes more sense to more people.
I think sensing. Oh, Commissioner Cash.
I actually did have one other question on this. So I think an issue related to this, there's a policy in here that says develop strategies to minimize adverse economic impacts on a jurisdiction when facilities do close. Mm-hmm. So in the event that someone moves out, there's the policy in there that just says that there should be work to mitigate. The original language that we have right now specifies that that's a facility of a certain size or of a certain number of employees, and that's not in the update. Is there any reason for that, or is it just to provide more flexibility?
More flexibility.
Thanks.
I think we've had comment and questions amply discussed here. So I'd like to ask if there'd be a motion to authorize releasing the draft federal workforce element update
So moved.
for 60-day public comment. So moved and second. All in favor, please signify by saying aye. Aye. Any opposed? Unanimously carried. Thank you. We're 3 for 3 here today on unanimous. That's great. Nice work. Okay, so we now want to move to the information presentation part of our agenda. So this is agenda item 7. Item 7A, the last item on the agenda, is an introduction to an information presentation on I-495 and I-270 managed lane study. Mr. Weil will introduce the project and turn it over to representatives from Maryland Department of Transportation State Highway Administration. Mr. Weil.
Thank you. Good afternoon, members of the commission. Representatives are here today from the Maryland State Highway Administration to brief you on the ongoing I-270 495 managed lanes study, which is being co-led by the Federal Highway Administration. NCPC is currently participating in the study as a cooperating agency. The study intent is to assess potential alternatives that will accommodate projected future traffic growth along the Maryland side of the I-495 Beltway and the southern segment of I-270, which is shown here in red. The state is proposing to accommodate the growth through construction of managed lanes, which are lanes that use tolling, access control, and other operational strategies to regulate their use. This would entail widening the Capitol Beltway right-of-way to accommodate additional travel lanes. Some local examples of managed lanes in the region include the high occupancy toll or hot lanes in Virginia and the Intercounty Connector in Maryland, which connects I-95 and 270. As seen here on the slide, the red study area terminates on the northwest side of the Beltway, just across the American Legion Bridge in Virginia, at the George Washington Memorial Parkway, and near Branch Avenue in Prince George's County, Maryland in the south. There are several identified federal interests related to the managed lanes study, with the most significant being the potential use of Capper-Crampton land for future Capitol Beltway widening. As you will hear in the presentation, the proposed environmental impact statement build alternatives could each impact up to 18 to 20 acres of property across Rock Creek, Sligo Creek, and Northwest Branch Stream Valley Parks. Per the Capper-Crampton Act, NCPC reviews and approves all changes to Capper-Crampton land. In accordance with the Memorandum of Understanding between NCPC and the Maryland National Capital Park and Planning Commission, Capper-Crampton land is to only be used for park-related uses such as trail access, stormwater management, and recreational uses. NCPC's authority per the Act and MOU requires the Commission to protect this land and allow non-park related uses only if it has been determined that no feasible alternative exists. The only time this occurred was in 1963 to accommodate the original construction of the I-495 Capitol Beltway, and in that instance, use of Rock Creek Park property was agreed upon in conjunction with significant mitigation. As you can see here in this demonstration of potential disturbance area in Rock Creek Park, defined by the blue shaded boundary lines, potentially affected parkland is situated directly adjacent to both sides of the Beltway, with Rock Creek located only about 50 feet away from the existing right-of-way in some areas. Of the three Capper-Crampton parks, each of the Beltway widening alternatives would have the greatest impact to Rock Creek Park, seen here as potentially encompassing up to approximately 13 acres. Potential lane expansion may also require land from a number of federal facilities and parks, which are shown here along the study area, such as NSA Bethesda, Beltsville Agricultural Research Center, Joint Base Andrews, and a number of National Park Service properties. The extent of the impact to each property is understood at only a conceptual level at this point, and study impact areas will be further refined and evaluated through the upcoming EIS analysis. All changes to these federal properties would require NCPC review per the National Capital Planning Act. And finally, there is a broader federal interest in improving the overall transportation network for the National Capital Region, including increasing multimodal connectivity, adding transit, pedestrian, and bicycle facilities, and encouraging more efficient travel behavior by federal employees. Before our guests from Mdot describe the study in more detail, I would first like to provide some initial planning background to help frame the purpose of today's information presentation. Since the study initiation in March 2018, NCPC staff has provided direction to Mdot and the study team regarding our commission review authorities and our federal interests as identified in the preceding slides. We are now at an important milestone where staff must comment on the proposed alternatives and whether they are sufficient for NCPC to meet its legal obligation under NEPA, which is related to the Capper-Crampton parks. At this time, we do not believe there to be an adequate range of build alternatives that meet the purpose and need while minimizing potential impacts to Capper-Crampton property. As such, we have urged Mdot to undertake additional analysis on diverting traffic to the Intercounty Connector as an avoidance measure, which they have agreed to do. And Mdot will provide additional context for that in their portion of the presentation. After Mdot concludes, we will then describe the ICC traffic diversion strategy in more detail and propose that Mdot assess the strategy as a fully separate build alternative through the EIS process. So with that, I will now turn the presentation over to Lisa Choplin, Jeff Folden, and Karen Brookman, who are managing various aspects of the study and are here to provide you with a more detailed description of the study effort. Thank you.
Welcome.
Good afternoon, everybody, and thank you for this opportunity to brief the Commission on the I-495 and I-270 managed lane study and receive your comments and questions at this important point in the NEPA process. My name is Lisa Choplin. I am with the Maryland Department of Transportation State Highway Administration. I am the I-495 and I-270 P3 Program Director. I also have with me this afternoon Jeff Folden, who is our Deputy Director, and Karen Brookman, who is our Environmental Manager for this study. We also have brought additional technical staff with us this afternoon, so after our presentation, they will also be here to assist with any questions that you might have. Next slide. The I-495 and I-270 P3 program represents over 70 miles of highways in the state of Maryland. We are currently about halfway through the I-495 and I-270 managed lane study, which covers 48 miles of roadway, including I-495 from south of the George Washington Memorial Parkway in Virginia to west of Maryland 5, and I-270 from I-495, including the east and west spurs, up to I-370. We are currently coordinating with the Virginia Department of Transportation, where our study abuts the environmental study for the I-495 next project. We also recently started pre-NEPA activities on the upper section of I-270 from I-370 to 70 in Frederick. And a future study will cover the section of the Beltway from Maryland 5 to the Woodrow Wilson Bridge, and will be done in collaboration with the Virginia Department of Transportation. Next slide. To date, Maryland has the distinction of having the second longest commuting times in the nation. On average, travelers experience 7 hours of congestion daily on I-270, and on I-495, it's even worse, with travelers facing 10 hours of congestion daily. This congestion leads to more traffic incidents, further degrading the reliability of this highways. And I-495 and I-270 include 6 of the top 15 most unreliable highway segments in Maryland in the morning, and 10 of the top 15 in the evening. As you can see from the graphic on the right, many segments experience speeds less than 15 miles an hour during the peak period. This graphic represents the 2040 no-build PM peak and assumes all projects in the constrained long-range plan are in place. Speeds will only continue to deteriorate on I-495 and I-270 without improvements. This also comes to a cost to the region. In 2017, the cost of congestion in the National Capital Region was $1.77 billion, which was a 40% increase from 2016, so in 1 year. Next slide. Despite reports, we do envision a balanced approach to solving our transportation challenges. The Transportation Planning Board recognizes that multiple initiatives are needed to address our region's ever-increasing congestion, including bringing jobs and people together where they live, expanding bus rapid transit, moving more people on Metro Rail, increasing teleworking, improving walking and biking access to transit, and expanding the express highway network with new managed lanes using dynamic pricing. However, the region plan, which the state and all the suburban Maryland jurisdictions signed, calls for an investment to public transportation in the National Capital Region at nearly a 2-to-1 ratio compared to highway improvements. Transit improvements alone will not be enough to address the serious congestion we have on I-495 and I-270. And that is why the long-range plan explicitly calls for new managed lanes on all of I-270 and I-495. Next slide, please. The purpose and need focuses on a project-level action concerning I-495 and I-270, considering concerns that have been identified by state, local, and regional transportation professionals over many years. It is not meant to address regional transportation issues. The purpose of this study is to develop a travel demand management solution that addresses congestion, improves trip reliability on I-495 and I-270 within the study limits, and enhances existing and planned multimodal mobility and connectivity. This study will also look to accommodate existing traffic and long-term traffic growth, trip reliability, provide additional roadway travel choices, accommodate homeland security, and improve the movement of goods and services. Additional goals of this study include incorporating funding sources for financial viability and developing the study in an environmentally responsible manner. I'm now going to turn the presentation over to Karen Brookman, and Karen will go through the study process.
Thank you, Lisa. I'm going to take the next few minutes to talk through the study process, which we are doing in compliance with the National Environmental Policy Act, or NEPA. I'm going to talk about the alternatives development, as well as the alternatives that we are recommending to be retained for detailed study in the environmental impact statement. The I-495 and I-270 managed lane study is the first major infrastructure project that is listed under Executive Order 13807. And this requires federal agencies to process the environmental reviews and authorization decisions for major infrastructure projects as one federal decision. We are following the 2018 One Federal Decision Memorandum of Understanding, which outlines the goal of completing the NEPA process within 2 years. We'll be seeking concurrence from cooperating agencies at 3 major milestones. We are also following a federal issue resolution process, and we will be completing a record of decision as one decision for all federal cooperating agencies. The National Capital Planning Commission was requested to be a cooperating agency for the managed lane study due to its approval authority over development with Stream Valley Parks acquired with Capper-Crampton funding. Next, I'm sorry, can you go back? Sorry, Mike. I do want to mention that the Federal Highway Administration, as Mike mentioned earlier, is the lead federal agency. We are a co-lead with Federal Highway. We have several cooperating agencies. For federal agencies, as I mentioned, NCPC, we also have the Army Corps of Engineers, Environmental Protection Agency, the National Park Service. We also have state agencies, Maryland Department of Environment, Maryland Department of Natural Resources, Virginia Department of Transportation, and Maryland National Capital Park and Planning Commission as a local agency. Next slide. So the intent of the one federal decision is to streamline the federal environmental review process for major infrastructure projects. In March of 2018, the Office of Management and Budget, as well as the Council on Environmental Quality, issued an MOU to heads of federal departments and agencies, which established a one federal decision framework. We are following this framework and guidance for the managed lane study. Part of that framework is to identify certain concurrence points for major milestones, the first of which is the purpose and need, the second of which is the alternatives retained for detailed study. That's the point in the study where we are currently. And the third is the preferred alternative. I want to mention that the definition of concurrence is not to support or oppose the project. It is simply that the information available at this stage is sufficient that we can proceed to detailed design in the environmental impact statement. Next slide. So I want to talk through the study process. A little over a year ago, so spring 2018, we started the scoping process, and that was with the publication of a notice of intent to develop an environmental impact statement. We held a series of agency meetings as well as public workshops, and that was to gain feedback on the scope of the study, potential alternatives, as well as environmental considerations. We then moved into summer of 2018, where we defined the purpose and need. We also developed a range of 15 preliminary alternatives. We held another series of public workshops where we requested feedback on those 15 preliminary alternatives. Starting earlier this year, we narrowed the range of 15 alternatives down to 7 using screening criteria from elements of our purpose and need statement. And just recently, we finished a series of 8 public workshops for Montgomery County, for Prince George's County, as well as a robust public engagement process, meeting with stakeholder and community association groups. This summer, through the end of this year, we'll be finishing environmental studies, identifying the recommended preferred alternative, and developing the environmental impact study. The end of 2020, we are proposing to publish the final EIS as well as the record of decision. Next slide. Next, I want to talk about the alternatives development process. One of the key elements of the NEPA process is to determine which alternatives are considered reasonable to be carried forward for detailed study in the environmental impact statement. And to reach this decision, agencies must perform evaluations to determine whether the alternatives meet the purpose and need. If an alternative does not meet the purpose and need, it's not considered reasonable and can be dismissed from further consideration. So as part of this process, and I mentioned earlier, we started with a preliminary range of alternatives. We had 15. With agency and public feedback and using our purpose and need statement and screening criteria, we narrowed the 15 down to 7 alternatives. We now have 6 build alternatives as well as the no build. We will be moving into recommending a preferred alternative, which we will identify in the environmental impact statement. Next slide. So I want to talk about managed lanes at this point. The graphic on the right is just an example of managed lanes with general purpose lanes. The yellow signifies the managed lanes. And managed lanes are a type of highway lane operated with a management scheme, such as variable tolling to optimize traffic flow, vehicle throughput, or both. High occupancy vehicle, or HOV lanes, are a type of management system, and they are highway lanes reserved for use by vehicles with a minimum number of passengers. High occupancy toll lanes, or HOT lanes, are high occupancy lanes that allow single occupancy vehicles to use them at a tolled rate, while HOV vehicles can go for free or at a reduced rate. Express toll lanes are lanes that are restricted to toll-paying vehicles. Next slide. So I'm going to take the next few minutes to walk through the alternatives that we are recommending to be retained for detailed study in the environmental impact statement. The first of which is the no-build alternative, Alternative 1. As Lisa had mentioned, this includes all projects in the fiscally constrained long-range transportation plan. These improvements include I-270 innovative congestion management improvements, which are transportation system management and transportation demand management improvements along I-270. It also considers the construction of the Purple Line, which is an 18-mile circumferential light rail system. The Corridor Cities Transit Way, which is a 15-mile high-capacity bus rapid transit route. Multiple other bus rapid transit systems, as well as increased trip capacity and frequency along all marked lines. Even with these additional improvements, significant congestion remains in the no-build year along both corridors. We are retaining the no-build as a baseline to compare the results of each alternative in the draft environmental impact statement. Next slide. Alternative 5 includes adding a high occupancy toll lane, HOT managed lane, in each direction on I-495, and this is denoted by the yellow. The other lanes are general purpose lanes as they exist today. But it also includes conversion of the existing high occupancy vehicle lane on I-270 to a high occupancy toll lane. Next slide. Alternative 8 includes adding 2 express toll managed lanes in each direction on I-495, and adding 1 express toll managed lane on I-270 while maintaining the existing high occupancy vehicle lane on I-270. Next slide. Alternative 9 consists of adding 2 high occupancy managed lanes in each direction on I-495 and converting the existing HOV lane on I-270 to HOT and adding an additional HOT on I-270. Next slide. Alternative 10 is similar to Alternative 9 on I-495, except that it is adding 2 express toll lanes as opposed to HOT lanes on I-495. And on I-270, it is adding 2 express toll lanes while maintaining the existing HOV lane on I-270. Next slide. The next two alternatives consist of adding reversible lanes on I-270 only. So on I-495, it's adding 2 high occupancy managed lanes on I-495, and on I-270, having 2 reverse HOT lanes. Next slide. Alternative 13C is adding 2 express toll lanes on I-495 and then having 2 express toll reversible lanes on I-270. So I'm going to hand it over to Jeff Folden. Jeff is going to talk about some of the elements of the alternatives retained and next steps.
Thank you, Karen. So first of all, standalone transit alternatives such as heavy rail, light rail, and bus rapid transit were included in the preliminary range of alternatives and evaluated during the screening process. And it was found that they did not meet the purpose and need of this study. Multiple studies in the region have shown that neither highway or transit improvements alone will address the existing traffic and the planned growth in the region. As an example, the Purple Line, which is currently under construction, was originally part of a Capital Beltway study in the early 2000s. It was broken out as a separate project-level NEPA study from the highway improvements. While the Purple Line is going to provide a travel choice for the region between New Carrollton and Bethesda, significant congestion will still exist along 495 where the Purple Line is. You could see that earlier when Lisa showed the traffic being between 15 and 30 miles per hour, pretty much in the entire Capital Beltway. But just to reiterate, all of the build alternatives and the no-build models include all the projects in the constrained long-range plan. So what that means is even with the Purple Line, the corridor city transit ways, multiple bus rapid transit routes, we're still going to have very significant congestion on 495 and 270 that needs addressed. Next slide. So the 495 and 270 managed lane study is looking to improve mobility, multimodal mobility and connectivity for transit, bicyclists, and pedestrians. Enhancements for transit, bicyclists, and pedestrians will be incorporated in the build alternatives regardless of the build alternative. For example, access will be improved to transit stations and transit-oriented developments along the corridor. This would improve access for people to Metro, MARC, and the Purple Line. Additionally, managed lanes will provide the infrastructure for more reliable, free flow, and faster commuter bus service, which is lacking today in the Maryland region. A transit working group has been established by the Maryland Department of Transportation with the local transit providers and the regional transit providers to explore opportunities to utilize these managed lanes for congestion relief and to utilize for increased transit service. Next slide. So this map shows kind of the overall transit network in the region. So you can see the existing Metro, MARC, Purple Line, and proposed bus rapid transit routes. With the exception of the Purple Line, all the routes basically across the Capital Beltway are 270. So improved access to these transit stations will be a significant benefit from this study. Studies have shown that express commuter bus is the most competitive suburban to suburban transit, and the new managed lanes will provide that infrastructure for that type of transit, providing reduced travel times and providing opportunities for new service. Examples locally in Virginia showed that 800 buses a day use the managed lanes on 95 and 495. And recently opened managed lanes in Georgia have seen buses getting a 15-minute reduction in travel times and ultimately providing a more reliable service for its customers. So we do see similar potentials in Maryland for the National Capital Region, connecting places like Bethesda and Tysons, and connecting places like New Carrollton, Largo, Branch Avenue with employment centers like the National Harbor and across the Woodrow Wilson Bridge into Virginia. This would open up new job opportunities for people in the region. Next slide. We do agree that transportation system management and travel demand management, also known as TSM-TDM, are needed to address congestion in the National Capital Region. TSM-TDM do not meet the purpose and need of this study as a standalone alternative. TSM-TDM alone are short-term improvements that optimize the system and will not address the long-term traffic within these corridors. TSM-TDM will also not provide a reliable trip, as the roadways will be over capacity, and will not enhance the movement of goods and services through the National Capital Region. TSM-TDM would also not enhance multimodal connectivity and access, as it would not improve the ability to access transit stations, would not remove barriers for bicyclists and pedestrians. Next slide. While TSM TDM as a standalone does not meet our purpose and need, it will be included in the study alternatives regardless of the build alternative. Strategies include managed lanes and congestion pricing to ensure a reliable and free flow trip when needed. And that includes free bus usage of the managed lanes. Adaptive ramp meter will also be retained along I-270. This adaptive ramp meter is actually under construction today. Enhancements will also be provided to acceleration and deceleration lanes to provide smoother merges and diverges on both 495 and 270. And we will be looking at pedestrian and bicycle enhancements at the various interchanges and barriers in the region to connect pedestrian and bike trails where needed. Next slide. And we heard from NCPC in their comments on our alternatives retained for detailed study. They'd like to see an alternative considered that utilizes the inter-county connector in I-270 to divert traffic from the north side of I-495. So this option would generally take traffic that's headed southbound on I-95 and headed for points in Virginia and utilize the inter-county connector and then down I-270. So we received that comment. We've begun preliminarily looking at this idea. So one thing we've noted is this trip to use the ICC in 270 is about 10 miles longer, 31 miles versus the 21-mile trip to go down I-95 and across 495 to get to the American Legion Bridge. So you're adding about a 50% distance for travelers to use this alternative. And we've also looked through existing studies on the inter-county connector. The most recent study from our sister agency, the Maryland Transportation Authority, projects that the inter-county connector in the westbound direction in the morning will be over capacity in many sections by 2033, and some sections even sooner by 2030. I mean, at a high level, this tells us that the ICC cannot accept additional traffic from other roadways. And in fact, traffic from the ICC will need to be diverted through dynamic pricing off of the ICC in the future to ensure we retain a free flow trip as intended on that roadway. Additionally, the outer loop of the Beltway from I-95 to US 29 has consistently been the most congested freeway expressway segment in Maryland in the morning since at least 2011, the first year we did a mobility report. And that was even before the ICC was in place. Additional capacity is needed on the north side of the Beltway to address this significant congestion. Otherwise, traffic that can't be accommodated by the ICC or I-485 will have to be diverted from these roadways onto the local system, further exacerbating congestion in the region. And as we've noted, we're committed to completing a detailed traffic analysis on this alternative of utilizing the ICC in 270. We'll be doing that as part of the Section 4F evaluation for the alternatives retained for detailed study. And if that proves to be a prudent and feasible alternative, it could then be incorporated into the preferred alternative of the study. Next slide. So as noted earlier, there's 3 Capper-Crampton parks that have been identified that potentially may be impacted by this study: Rock Creek Stream Valley Park, Sligo Creek Park, and Northwest Branch Stream Valley Park. Preliminary impacts are estimated to be about 20.7 acres at the worst case scenario. But I just want to reiterate, these are worst case preliminary impacts and are going to be continued to be further avoided and minimized as the study moves forward. More detailed information will be completed through the remainder of the year and provided in the 4F evaluation and draft environmental impact statement. It's also important to note, as we're looking to work with the private sector on this project, we're going to be incentivizing them to further continue to avoid and minimize impacts to these important properties. Next slide. And I just wanted to talk a minute about next steps. We're going to be continuing our public engagement efforts throughout the year. We're also going to be completing the technical studies for air, noise, traffic, other disciplines over the rest of the year, completing the draft environmental impact statement, and publishing that in December of 2019. We'll also have multiple public hearings at the beginning of 2020 to solicit more public feedback, and we'll be addressing that public feedback. And our plan is to complete a final environmental impact statement and record of decision by by the fall of 2020. So I just want to also note, I don't think we noted earlier, that Federal Highway is also here with us. So they're in the audience if you have questions for them as well. But I am going to turn it back over to Mike for his more perspective from NCPC.
Thank you. So as previously stated, we are now at an important milestone where staff must comment on the sufficiency of the proposed EIS alternative set, which would ultimately serve the Commission's legal obligation for impact analysis to Capper-Crampton property under NEPA. As previously stated, at this time, NCPC staff does not believe there to be an adequate range of build alternatives that minimize potential parkland impacts. However, we are encouraged that Mdot has begun to study an additional transportation system management scheme that would divert beltway traffic to the inter-county connector as requested by NCPC and also staff from the Maryland National Capital Park and Planning Commission. To help illustrate this potential TSM diversion strategy, here is the study area again, with green dots representing the 3 potentially affected Capper-Crampton parks adjacent to the Beltway between I-95 and I-270. And this shows a portion of our region's traffic naturally using the Beltway segment when traveling from the northeast to the American Legion Bridge between Maryland and Virginia. MNC PPC stated in a recent comment letter to the state that they believe that almost 20% of the southbound traffic flow along I-95 does use this route to travel to the American Legion Bridge as shown here. And it may be possible to divert enough of this traffic to the ICC as shown here through additional dynamic messaging and various geometric improvements, which may eliminate the need to have to widen the Capitol Beltway section adjacent to Capper-Crampton Parkland. And Mdot is analyzing this potential traffic diversion within the context of the current set of their proposed EIS build alternatives. Though it is important to note a distinction between the current analysis and what NCPC staff is proposing. While Mdot is incorporating the ICC strategy in their current traffic modeling, NCPC staff believes that Mdot should analyze the strategy as a fully separate build alternative within the EIS, which would allow our commission to preserve its ability to satisfy review obligations under NEPA and per the Capper-Crampton Act MOU, which defines our protective role over park property. Currently, the only alternatives under consideration that does not impact Capper-Crampton Parkland is the current no-build alternative, which does not meet the study purpose and need. While the other alternatives are projected to impact between 18 to 20 acres of Capper-Crampton Park property. The proposed ICC alternative may preserve both Capper-Crampton property and satisfy the study's purpose and need, assessed on an equal basis with the other build alternatives. And also one other item in follow-up to previous NCPC staff comments, we would like to meet with Mdot and MNC PPC to better understand how various constrained long-range plan transit projects are reflected in the EIS transportation model. Currently, the study team has conveyed that future projects such as the Corridor Cities Transitway will be modeled in each alternative. However, NCPC staff has not seen any detailed data that shows how these planned projects will affect forecasted study area traffic growth. And I believe that Maryland National Capital Park and Planning Commission has also expressed an interest in learning more about this as well. So with that, that concludes my portion of the presentation. And I will now turn the floor back over to the Commission for questions and comments to Mdot. And we also have a representative here from the Maryland National Capital Park and Planning Commission, Mr. Steve Aldrich, who can respond to the study from their perspective. Thank you.
All right. Well, thank you, Mr. Weil, and thank you, Ms. Choplin, Ms. Brookman, and Mr. Folden. Obviously, a very informative presentation. Obviously, a lot that has been thought through already, and a lot of questions are before us as we move quickly ahead. I want to just speak to the Commission for a minute. Clearly, there are several federal interests to consider here in terms of NCPC's review. The use of the Capper-Crampton Parkland for widening these freeways is certainly one of the most important, since it would impact possibly up to 20 acres of Capper-Crampton Parkland, and any impacts on this land would need to be approved by NCPC. Also want to remind us that this is an information presentation, so we don't offer our comments as a single body, but as individual comments from each of us as commissioners to offer our own insights or questions, and to provide that as a kind of a precursor to any official review. And then but following our discussion on this project, I'm going to try to take some notes, and if at the end of this, maybe we'll all take notes and try to combine them into a set of ideas that could help take these comments back for your further consideration. So I guess with that, let's open this up to comments, questions, etc. Mr. May.
Okay, so first of all, in case you all don't know, I mean, I'm here representing the Department of the Interior, but I work for the National Park Service, and my staff has been coordinating with everybody under the sun on this, Mdot, obviously especially, and we appreciate the level of coordination that we have received so far. We're also obviously working with Vdot on their side of this when you cross the bridge and the impacts of their study. We do appreciate the level of coordination that's occurring. I do want to remind everybody here in this room about the other potential impacts that are not necessarily areas for NCPC decision-making or approval, which are the impacts to the parkways under the jurisdiction of the National Park Service, C&O Canal, and miscellaneous other aspects of this. But there are obviously very significant concerns associated with a widening of a road to this extent and what it could do to the interchanges, to the parkland that's affected. And I do have to remind people occasionally that parkways are parks, they're not freeways. And so even though we function that way and to a great extent, we are charged with trying to maintain that park-like character on our roads. And so, having massive two-lane feeders coming off of express roads with people barreling in at 60 miles an hour onto what is supposed to be a parkway experience is problematic. So we want to try to do whatever we can to help you achieve the goals that you want to achieve, but at the same time maintain the character of the parkland. So I think that's just very general comments. My staff has been working very closely with you, and we'll continue to coordinate and share the concerns that we have as you go through the process. And of course, I will also say that the mere process by which such widenings can occur is tremendously complicated for us. The National Park Service does not have a ready authority to be able to allow rights of way for transportation purposes. So when we undertake to grant this authority in some way, it means doing essentially a land exchange, which is a terribly complicated process. We had to do that for a little tiny bit of land associated with the Purple Line. It got started, I don't know, 5 years ago, something like that, and it's not complete. And that's obviously under construction. There are ways that we can make that happen, but this is a really big one. This is a really big one, and it's going to take a very long time for us to do the things that we would have to do. So, not that we don't want to move them faster, they just take a lot of time. And of course, we'll be very attentive to the 4F process because that's the only way we could do it in the first place. Thanks.
Other comments, questions? Commissioner White?
Thank you for the presentation. It was very helpful. I'm curious, what do you consider the most congested area, if this is the second most congested? I think the list changes all the time, but you started off in your presentation saying this was the second highest commuting time in the country.
The highest was New York, and actually the difference between New York and Maryland is minutes. It's or half a minute. It's like 0.1, right? So if you round for Maryland, we are actually tied first in the nation. But if you take specific to the decimal point, if you take specific to the decimal point, we're second.
I assumed it, but I wanted to know what the official number one was. I live in Houston, Texas, the land of freeways, and we're grappling with a lot of the same issues, and there's a lot of discussion around induced demand. and how the accomplishment of I-10, locally known, or locally we brag or lament about it's the widest freeway in the world. It's already exceeded the projections of, what it was supposed to serve. So I'm really cautious about modeling that shows how this is going to help reduce congestion, and then we're just going to have to widen it again. So I'm a real skeptic of some of the projections, nothing personal, but I find it really troubling to hear that we're, again, trying to pave our way to a solution. So I really support the staff's request to look at other alternatives, and because we have an obligation to protect the parkland, clearly we would like to see that in the modeling. So I would implore that you work with our staff to look at other ways to take into consideration, even further consideration than you already have in terms of the other alternatives for alternative transportation, because we're not going to build our way out of this problem. And it's interesting in the federal elements conversation about what we're trying to do in terms of thinking about our future and our growth, and how we manage the growth and the traffic that comes with it. So again, I would just ask you to be fair in the analysis about the benefits of doing this further look. Thanks.
Commissioner Wright.
I have what she said, plus a question, because I've read a lot about this too. It's counterintuitive, right? Everybody thinks you make it wider and it'll be better, but the research suggests that that's not the case. So my question is, has the ICC alternative been rejected that the NCPC staff is urging you to consider? Has that decision already been made to eliminate it? Can you speak to some of the reasons why you're not, why you don't seem enthusiastic about it?
Yeah. I guess I'll just start. Maybe Karen might add on to this. We're absolutely committed to looking at it.
You are?
Yes, absolutely. We're
As a full-fledged alternative?
As a 4F avoidance alternative. We're fully committed to doing that.
Okay, then I misunderstood.
Yeah. Now, if you're asking the enthusiasm.
It's not the same thing as a SAR.
It's not the same as a full-blown
FAR.
alternative.
I'll let Karen
SFAR.
can speak to that in a second. I'm just, like we said, from our high-level look at this, the traffic on the ICC will be over capacity. So the point being, traffic can't go to the ICC. If it can't be on 495, it's got to go somewhere else in the region. That's the only point. So
Say that again?
the ICC will be over capacity.
In what year?
2033, many segments going westbound. If you go back to,
Segments going westbound?
which is the main thing we're talking about, is going south on 95, then westbound the ICC. That will be over capacity in 2033. Therefore, it can't accept more cars. It can't accept any more vehicles. So that's our concern, is simply there's just not enough capacity in the ICC without.
When was that stretch of 495 deemed over capacity?
Oh, it's been over capacity I've lived in Maryland for 17 years. It's been over capacity at least as long as I've lived here.
Right.
So I can't go back past that, but we've been looking at it since the early 90s.
So when you looked at the model, the reason I ask is because it's clearly not over capacity now. I use it all the time. And it's lovely.
Sorry, the ICC?
Talking about the ICC.
The ICC.
No, the ICC is absolutely not over capacity.
Right, so so 14 years from now, it'll be like 495 is what you're saying, going west. But is that model based on clearly that's based on, is that assumption based on the absence of the messaging that will divert the traffic, or just traffic? Right now, you're not urged to come off of 95. There is no light bulb that goes off for people that says, gee, you should get off now and go on the ICC to come down 270 to get to the American Legion Bridge. So what I'm asking is the capacity deadline of 2033 based on diversion or not?
not.
So the expectation is, so I guess, how do you do that modeling? On what's the underlying assumption that this now very uncrowded road in a dozen years with no change, what's the assumption of that model?
Well, the first thing we do is, and I could probably ask our traffic expert to come here and explain it much better than me, but we look at the regional model and how that grows, so based off of land use, and the traffic grows. I mean, for example,
And employment patterns.
Exactly.
Okay.
I mean, just what we've seen in the ICC in the last few years, it's a 3.5% to 4.5% growth rate over the last 2 or 3 years. So people have gone from the year of opening.
They're figuring it out.
It's actually doubled in
Yeah.
capacity since the year of opening. So it's growing.
Yeah. Okay.
Karen, you want to talk about it from the standalone alternatives?
Sure. Sure. So the option that we're talking about is essentially build alternatives on the eastern side and the western side with the no build on the top side. That's essentially what we're talking about.
I didn't understand. Could you clarify in different words? I heard all those words, but I didn't understand any of them.
The IC, yeah. Might be easier visually to show it with the diversion, the ICC map.
The graphics that we made with the big arrows? Okay.
Yep.
Oh. There we go.
Right. So essentially what is being proposed is that 95 and to the east of 95, I should say, so the eastern portion of the study area would be a build alternative, would have managed lanes. I-270 to the western side, to the American Legion Bridge, would also have managed lanes. Along I-270 would also have managed lanes. It's literally that top side between the east spur on I-270 and I-95 that would be the no build. And we're suggesting that the traffic is diverted to the ICC. So essentially you have portions of a build alternative and the no build on the top side, which is consistent with the Section 4F avoidance alternative. We would be, if that were the case and we could pursue this, it would essentially be an avoidance alternative for those 3 Capra-Crampton funded parks along the top side. So it is a full alternative that we will be analyzing. If it's prudent and feasible, if it's found to be prudent and feasible, it will become part of the preferred alternative. And that's with any avoidance option that we look at through the Section 4F analysis.
I guess if I could jump in, is that okay with you? I guess the logic of your presentation on that point is hard for me to understand. Because I also heard, I'm going to add to, I'll see your ICC and raise you with the purple line and the CCT. Because I also heard that in the no-build scenario, the purple line and the CCT have already been considered as part of the no-build. And I guess since neither of those exist, it's quite different in terms of the way, at least intuitively, I can understand how you can project those mass transit initiatives and still confidently predict that that as part of just a no build means that I think we see enough EIS and NEPA studies here that I haven't seen one where a no build scenario is the one that goes forward, okay? So I don't have the confidence that placing that solely in the no build scenario as opposed to a separate alternative, which is what I think we're asking for, really moves the needle for this commission. And I think you're going to need to hear that as part of what you take back. We're happy to hear, but I can say that what I perceived in this presentation, and I'm the representative from Maryland, okay? So my responsibility is both as it relates to the quality of life for transit, but also to preserve the natural resources and parks for all Maryland residents, okay? So this is not a cut and dry idea, at least in my mind, that we can exclude one and not the other. And since if you didn't want to deal with us, okay, then having the ICC as one alternative that would avoid all the Capper-Crampton lands, this would be a good pathway for you to seriously consider as a separate alternative. Happy to hear your comments.
First, I can start off, again, good afternoon. My name is Matt Snare. I'm working on the traffic analysis for Mdot SHA team. So your first point was about how do we incorporate some of the purple line and CCT into our future projections. And so what we do is we use a regional forecasting model, which is run and maintained by the Metropolitan Washington Council of Governments, COG. We work closely with them. They do a release of a regional model that incorporates all planned improvements in the CLRP, including transit and roadway improvements. They get land use estimates from the different jurisdictions that they incorporate into their model, and their model is calibrated to project travel throughout the region based on all those inputs of land use as well as the infrastructure. So we do use that. That is our main forecasting tool. We take that data from them, and that projects the traffic that will be on the roadways after all the other trips, the transit trips, the pedestrian trips are all taken out of there. So that's, when we talk about that being factored in, that's how it's done. It's through the approved COG model and the outputs from that. Then we enter that model into our traffic simulation model to get kind of those speed outputs and the congestion outputs. So that's how that gets factored in there.
Okay.
Now,
I think what I'm saying is something, yes, thank you, that's good. That helps us understand the computer behind the human rational thinking sometimes, but where I'm going is that what I heard in Mr. Fulden's presentation is that those have already been considered and didn't move the needle. That's what I heard, okay? So when you now tell us, excuse me, if you wouldn't mind, when you now tell us that that's going to be part of the no-build solution, which you already have a conclusion about the no-build solution, it makes it difficult for us to sit here and believe that that would in fact be isolated and articulated as a point of view, as a real alternative for us to have actually looked at that information. It's sort of what's behind the screen without really having it be brought forward. And so, I mean, that leads to another question that I have, which really has to do with the 8 public workshops. There were 7 at one point and then 8. I don't know which one it was. But I guess I'd love to hear how those alternatives were informed by those 8 public workshops. Because from what I hear in the community is that not all the community is interested, and so in this is a solution. So I need to understand that the feedback from the workshops actually did inform what all look like building more lanes on the Beltway and 270.
Can I start with your first point? I think maybe it was not a great explanation of the alternative, and so I just want to maybe reiterate that the difference between just the no-build, that would be along all 48 miles. So doing nothing, and in 2040, as Matt suggested, even with all the projects in the CLRP, we're still talking about significant congestion. The difference with this proposal would be that you could take alternative 5 or alternative 9 and just simply not have improvements on the top side of the Beltway, assuming traffic would be diverted to the ICC. So there's a difference, right? Instead of just having no build along 48 miles, you could implement alternatives 5 or 9 on the east side and west side, which could have a traffic benefit. And that's part of the analysis that we're committed to doing. Right? I hope that's a better
And would you be able to share that analysis with staff at a level that they could discern the kind of separate elements of that decision-making process.
Absolutely.
I have a quick question. So has there been any thought, I forget what you called the messaging that you would use to get people off of 95?
It was dynamic signing.
Dynamic signing, that's right, as opposed to dynamic tolls. Yes. So, is there any consideration of doing that regardless, to provide some relief in the immediate future? Because that's a pretty cheap solution, right? You've got roadway that's under capacity now. Okay, it's not 2033, and I've never been at any time of the day on the ICC when it's been anything but sparsely populated. Is there any thought to doing that now? To to divert some of the traffic now to this different route?
So we could certainly take that under discussion with the Maryland Transportation Authority. Maryland Transportation Authority is the entity that is responsible for the ICC. That is not an Mdot SHA roadway. But one comment I would make is that people naturally do that today by using their smartphones.
Yeah, but that's not an answer, respectfully.
Okay.
I mean, really, because you didn't parse the difference between who's in charge of what roads when you're presenting the alternative. So that's not a good answer for why you can't do it as an interim solution. It tells me that the answer is no, because you haven't had that conversation, which seems weird to me because you've got an undercapacity roadway. It doesn't cost anything, well, it costs something, but it's nothing like what you're talking about in terms of investment. And it would probably give you a whole nother data set that could inform your decision making. I mean, it seems kind of weird that you wouldn't think about doing that now, because it's cheap and easy. And it would provide some relief now to the people who are sitting on the Beltway trying to get to the American Legion Bridge. So why wouldn't you have had that conversation?
It's a fair comment. We can have that dialogue with we can have that dialogue with the Transportation Authority.
Okay, you can, but will you?
Well, yes, we will have that conversation with the Transportation Authority. I'm sorry, the question was asked previously about the comments on the public workshop, so Karen, do you want to go back and address that?
So in addition to the 8 public workshops, Lisa, Jeff, and I have gone out to over 25 community associations and stakeholder groups and made individual presentations. We've even gone to folks' homes to make sort of private presentations and receive feedback. And the feedback that we have gotten has been contrary to maybe what you've heard in the media, sort of all over the place, right? So we've heard some comments about obviously not wanting to impact property, parkland, questions and concerns about noise and air. We have heard support. We've heard that congestion's bad, my commute home is horrific, do something about it. So it's been sort of all over the place. But I will say, related to the alternatives, consistently we have heard about moving people and having better access to transit. That has been consistent through the life of the study, and that is one of the reasons why we modified the purpose and need early on to include enhancing multimodal connectivity and mobility. That was in response to what we were hearing relating to transit.
Including from...
That's correct, yes. In addition, we...
Question about that, real quick. I saw the pictures of buses in the lanes, so I appreciated that. How do you project that demand? Commissioner White was talking about Houston and sort of, I wrote it down, pave our way to a solution. How do you project the multimodal participation of users of these roads with that modeling as, in terms of, is it one lane, two lanes, no lanes? How do you do that?
So that's a fair question, and as you can imagine, currently, because of the congestion, there's not a lot of bus usage on the corridors, right? They're in the same traffic everyone else is, so they don't have a reliable trip. As Jeff mentioned, there's a transit working group that's being developed, and I think the question that you're asking is something that can be answered through that working group. We are meeting with transit providers through that working group, so WMATA, all of the counties, Maryland Transit Administration, and so I think that the answer to that question will come out of that working group.
And will that be, I want to say, a baseline element of all alternative evaluations?
Not sure how to answer that exactly. Yeah, I mean, it will be regardless of the alternative retained.
Mm-hmm. The thing that, I'm not a data scientist, but I spend a lot of time in data, and the assumptions often help prove the outcome or not. And so identifying the impacts of change caused by an assumption like this one, where it's, we have mass transit using those lanes versus today we don't. What's the impact of that? Just like the question of, in my opinion, of how many people will ride that purple line versus not, or how many people will ride the CCT versus not, is a little bit based on assumptions, because they don't exist today. It's hard to, you would have a hard time convincing me that there's exact science associated with any of those assumptions. We use the best we can, and I get that. So it would be good if there was a way to isolate each of those considerations as a way to layer, if you will, the communication associated with and impacts associated with these different elements in selecting or rejecting different alternatives. So if there's a way that you can provide that as part of, because if you come back to this commission wanting to impact the Capper-Crampton lands, and we don't understand those layered effects, we're going to have a very difficult time approving this move, okay? We are guided by law to protect the parklands, to ensure that those lands are for park use only. So it will have to be a very compelling, I know my fellow commissioners, we're nice people, but we need to understand. So if this is unofficial input today, and we appreciate you coming and the work that you're doing, and clearly it's a very complex undertaking. But I think it's going to be important for us and staff to be able to understand the impacts of these various elements as you layer them into the discussion. Yes, Commissioner Kay.
I wanted to go back to the discussion about the diversion to the ICC, and there was a lot of talk about capacity. So my understanding is that the whole point of the ICC and the model that it was built on was you might be willing to actually pay $30 because you'll have a nice driving experience and you won't run into congestion. So when you're saying that that the ICC will be over capacity, we're not talking over capacity like the Beltway is right now, where there's a crawl at 2 miles an hour. I imagine that you're going to have to not let some people onto the ICC to preserve how the ICC works. So we're not talking about the ICC is going to be the Beltway by 2033. We're talking that the ICC, you're going to have to divert people away in order to keep the traffic on there flowing. Is that correct?
That is accurate.
So I feel like that part of what you're doing is saying you don't necessarily want to put people on the ICC. You want to be able to, just preserve that road as a fast-moving thing. It's not really capacity. It's that you won't be able to charge people to do that. I just feel like there's some kind of weird incentives when you're talking about capacity on the Beltway versus the ICC, because it's not the same thing. You're never going to let the ICC become the Beltway, because then no one will pay to use it, and then the funding structure falls apart. So versus maybe just converting the ICC and getting rid of that whole model and just actually letting it have some capacity and let people make rational decisions without the financial or traffic incentives on which way they'd actually go. I mean, is that part of the mix of everything you're looking at, is possibly rethinking the ICC, given all the money you're spending on this, that maybe that could be an alternative, or one of the things that's in the mix when you're looking at some of these other routes, especially the diversion? Could you resolve the traffic issues on the Beltway by just making the ICC free?
I don't think so, but I'm not a traffic engineer.
Or what would be the effect of that be? I mean, would it balance things out better?
Could you, excuse me, could you step up to the microphone, just so that we're recording this, so otherwise we can't hear you?
Yeah, I mean, a lot of that gets down to how the Maryland Transportation Authority has laid out and their policy and their laws about, tolling their facilities that they maintain. And so I think that's not for us to answer whether that is possible to be done. As far as whether it could relieve congestion if more traffic was over there, potentially, yes. But I think that's just so far out of our jurisdiction that hasn't been a consideration yet.
And what would you say is driving this increased demand on the Beltway? I mean, has there been, I'm one of the DC people, I follow DC's population growth. I mean, are we really booming in population that much more in Maryland that it's really creating this demand? Or there's some talk about the induced demand.
Well, I think part of it is it's an existing problem already, so it's not all just about growth that's expected. But we do expect, I believe it was 1 million more people in the region. Yeah.
It's, so by 2040, 1.3 million more people in the region, as well as 1 million more jobs. So the region is going to continue to grow as industry comes into the region, but just as people move from various places. But so there is an increase in population as well as jobs expected in the next 20 years.
But I can speak about induced demand. We have heard that a lot for sure about and the concept that was brought up that you can't just build your way out of congestion. If you build pavement, it'll just refill. So part of that is that because we're proposing to manage the new lanes, we can manage that extra capacity. So I think one of the issues is if you build new general purpose lanes, then they can just backfill and get congested again. By proposing managed lanes that have a dynamic toll component to them, we can keep those lanes free flowing and avoid that problem of them reaching capacity right after they were built. As far as induced demand, we do modeling for that to see how much more traffic would be drawn. And really what we're seeing is more of what we call not induced demand, but demand that is avoiding the Beltway now. So they're currently taking back routes, or they're going at 5 a.m. or 11 a.m. instead of when they want to be traveling. And so we definitely expect that this project would attract that type of travel, but not necessarily more trips because of this project. I think we're seeing about a 1% increase region-wide in actual new trips as a result of this project.
I'll just close and say, I mean, this is, again, from a DC perspective, I think one of the best things that the district ever did was avoiding inner beltways, all these other ridiculous transportation things that were looked at way back in the day to relieve congestion. And I mean, in the past 13 years, we've grown by 20%, and I think we're doing relatively well with a really great transit system and stuff. We were able to do it all without essentially dividing up the city with all that. I mean, and you said the birthplace of highways. I'm actually from Detroit, and I mean, I can tell you that's just depressing out there. I mean, everything just cut up. I mean, it destroys neighborhoods. It has a lot of negative impacts, and I think that I would just say from a broader perspective, I think anything you can do to mitigate having to just keep fulfilling an unquenchable demand that will just keep appearing as long as you keep doing these projects. I think that that is just saying that you should really look at every alternative you can. And I think that looking at the ICC, I mean, bureaucracy, I guess, is just really tough in a lot of cases. And if that's not necessarily your department and you can't talk about better options, but I think that something as important as this, it's maybe time to be a little bit more creative.
Okay, any other comments or questions? Okay, let me try to take a few notes. Maybe my fellow commissioners will help me if I leave something off, but obviously this is very complicated topic. We do appreciate you coming and giving us a preview of this because it helps to educate us on your process, your approach, and the way you have to sort of get your arms around a very complex future challenge for all of us. I think I'm guessing that at the end of this meeting, staff will be in contact with you, as you have been already, to kind of convey a more formal kind of response. But I think, what I heard is there are still some questions about, the ability to build our way out of this problem. So, I think the more you can help us understand the insights that you have regarding this and how mass transit may or may not impact this, particularly, I think we've identified three things here today: the layers of the purple line and how that'll affect, the layers of the CCT and how that'll affect, and the layers of the ICC and how that will affect our, through this transit working group project. Sounds like a very promising exercise as part of what's feeding that. Will that working group be working sort of on a parallel track throughout the entire study period that you're about to undertake?
I guess the timeline or timeframe of that working group has not been defined as when it would stop. I can tell you that we already have had an initial meeting, which the Secretary of Transportation chaired, and we are going to be starting up monthly meetings with that working group, starting, I think it's at the end of this month or the end of this month. So as far as how far that goes along in the process, I can't tell you if it's going to end before the end of the study, or it may go beyond, because as we mentioned earlier in the presentation, beyond this managed lane study, we have a pre-NEPA study that we've started on the remainder of I-270, and then there's the third one. So it could even go beyond this managed lane study. I just don't have a time frame for that.
Mm-hmm. Okay, well, we'll be keen on hearing how its voice is coming through the next time we get to exchange. I think, what you're hearing is strong support for multimodal connectivity improvements and how that will impact the decision-making process through the study of alternatives. And then I think that the jury's still out on, I'm not convinced myself that having this approach as part of only the layers of all of your alternatives as opposed to a separate one is going to be adequate for us. Again, there's two parts to this. One is just the intuitive nature of the fact that the ICC currently is underutilized and has been since it opened and has not met the projections that were projected early on in its usage. So not sure why we now can confidently say by 2034 it will. We haven't met it once as far as I know yet. Yes, maybe it's doubled since its opening, but that's not really where it intended to be on, up to this point. So that's layer one, and I think layer two is because the Capper-Crampton lands are impacted by all of your alternatives except the no-build. What we're kind of saying to you is you can avoid all this with us if you can find a way to have the ICC have a bigger role in this conversation so that Capper-Crampton, we can be convinced that any further impact that may come from all of it is solidified by your proving to us that you have fully studied it as its own alternative, and therefore we've studied it and we still have no choice. That Mr. Folden's comments are correct, that by 2034, on May 1st, 2034, we know we're going to be over capacity. I hope I live long enough to look you up and we'll have a beer. And I guess, I think the National Park Service's comment about land swaps and the complex nature of that was something that I learned something here today, but I'm not surprised about how time-consuming that kind of activity is. And so we'll hope you consider that. And then Commissioner Wright's comment about, are there ways to start to look at signage now to push traffic to the ICC now so that improvements can be made now? And what can we learn from that as part of this? I know it's maybe outside your jurisdiction apparently, but since this is a holistic thing, we made your life tougher here, but we can all help each other get through the night if we listen to each other. So we appreciate that. Did I miss any other major summary points? Okay, well, thank you. We do appreciate it, even though it may not seem like. You need to know that this isn't as tough as we can be, okay? Trust me. And, and we think about things like parking, and we think about things like intermodal. When the Pentagon comes and wants to expand or do something with their parking, we're very focused on these kinds of traffic management issues. So it's an important element of this commission's purview, and now with the Capper-Crampton lands, it adds another layer to that. So we do appreciate your input.
And thank you for having us this afternoon.
My pleasure. Thank you. I think with that, we can call the meeting adjourned. Thank you very much. Have a good summer. We're off in August, and we'll see you September 4th.